Before I get started, I want to express my gratitude to a number of the trustees and members who've served as mentors to me over the past 2 years. Obviously, it's difficult to be based in Cairo and not have any connections, let's say, outside of Cairo. Obviously, that's not the case because I had someone like Joel Millman, former Wall Street Journal reporter, always giving me insightful feedback. I had someone like L. Carl Brown, who's one of the most esteemed Middle East political scientists, and always responded to emails and always had really insightful commentary for me. And I also want to recognize Gregory Pfeiffer, who's been a real mentor to me on this fellowship. So thank you. It's really you, trustees in particular, but really the entire board that I'm so grateful for to have this opportunity. And I'm going to tell you all about how I've spent 2 jam-packed years in Cairo and traversing across the Middle East, but really I can't thank you enough for your generosity and support. I also want to recognize Bob Levinson, who hosted me for one of the most fun evenings in October, a salon where we were able to bring together new and old friends to talk about some of my work and research, so I'm really grateful for that. Thank you, Bob. And, of course, Bob's big secret is he has a collection of David Levine caricatures from the New York Review, including caricatures of himself. So that was a real treat to get an insight into the art of David Levine. I also want to recognize former fellows who I wouldn't be here today without them. One in particular, Susie Hansen, who I happened to be in Istanbul. There was a coup in Egypt in 2013. I was sort of in exile. I don't like to use that word lightly. I think that's quite a crass word to use. But I was in Istanbul for a break, and I ran into Susie Hansen, and she told me about this fellowship. And now she's gone on to write incredible articles for New York Magazine about the purge and crackdown in Turkey. So let me set a scene for you. And this is just a taste of the Cairo that some of us might know, the kind of bustling, action-packed, metropolis, megalopolis, that for me, art and comics in particular captures best. But I want to set a different scene for you. One you might be familiar with if you've been reading the news and recent stories from Egypt. This is in March. What was thought to be a giant Colossus of Ramses was discovered in a neighborhood north of Cairo, about an hour away, quite working class neighborhood. They were excavating a new shopping mall to relocate some local vendors. And lo and behold, this is a country where the ancient past is always present. And this massive colossus was discovered in below the water table. So it was quite difficult to extract. And I wish I would have gone there myself to check it out. But a reporter friend of mine, Jad Khalil, had sort of conveyed to me his jaunt through all these neighborhoods and alleys to find it, and talking with all the people in the neighborhood. So where am I going with this? I study cartoons, and there was obviously an outpouring of jokes about this Colossus head. And this is just a teaser. I can give you all the punchlines later. But you know, this kind of ancient past that we tend to think is very distant becomes the source of punchlines for the cartoonists and comic artists of Egypt. And many of them made fun of the way that the extraction or the excavation process happened in this muddy thing. There were lots of jokes about pharaohs having nightmares, how they live these glamorous lives and now they end up in a pool of mud. One of my favorites was they wrapped it in a Spider-Man blanket, because of, that was just what they had around to protect it after they'd excavated it. And of course, then someone put Spider-Man smoking a hookah next to that. Oh, this one is also terrific. It's kind of a mourning pharaoh. What is this crap? Because one of the excavation team is just kind of hanging out on this. I mean, you could just see how massive this is to just stumble across this in a quite random pit in what was the ancient city of Heliopolis. But I went to the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square with my little cousin, and I don't know, some of you have probably been there. It's a jamboree of more antiquities than you can imagine. There's not even room inside the museum to fit this Colossus, so it's just sitting in Tahrir Square now, in the courtyard. And there's something hilarious about stumbling upon the placard, and it says excavated March 8th, 2017, and really a notion of living history, and how, I don't want to say the pharaohs still haunt Egypt, but I did make a kind of silly joke about, another toppled pharaoh in Tahrir Square. So here we have, a Colossus right in the middle of it all. So why am I telling you this? I think this is what most of you would think of as Egyptian art. And rightly so. I mean, it's incomparable, the incredible work of Egyptian tombs and architecture and hieroglyphics. But I've really had the honor and the privilege over the past 2 years as an ICWA fellow and previously as a Fulbright scholar and a journalist in Cairo to think about what's happening in contemporary Egypt and the contemporary Middle East. Still, the hints of the ancient, as I say, are always present. I wander through the Friday market in Cairo, and I came across a black market seller of little knickknacks that, who knows of their provenance, but they may or may not be thousands of years old. Naturally, Tut and Nefertiti, these are the things that might be on your minds when you hear about a fellow who's been researching art in Egypt. But here I am to dispel those assumptions, and I want to tell you about my fellowship over the past 2 years. So the Cairo I've fallen in love with has changed a lot. I was first a student of Arabic in 2007 at the American University. I was working in Washington for several years, and when the uprisings happened, I just had this gut feeling that I had to come back and see it for myself. And I was working various jobs and fellowships, but the opportunity of ICWA was to really take risks and experiment. And I want to tell you a little bit about the goal of my fellowship and what ICWA and what this incredible organization has allowed me to do. What I wrote in my application, this is already in 2014, it seems like a million years ago. The Western media has offered a monochromatic view of the Middle East, sensationalizing terrorism and conflict while overlooking more complex narratives. Whether reporting on the Muslim Brotherhood or ISIS, news outlets prefer to latch on to strife, projecting a region whose fault lines lack context. But for me, the Middle East's significant cultural and social currents deserve a wide hearing. And the American public rarely hears about the paperbacks, the films, the songs, or the comics that many in Egypt and across the Middle East enjoy on a daily basis. And I wanted to change that equation through my fellowship. The exciting part of being an ICWA fellow, being an ICWA, sorry, it sounds like an Arabic verb. For those of you who don't know, it means get stronger, ICWA. Those of us, for those of us who have been fellows, you know that you can get beyond the news. And I would write these monthly dispatches where I could experiment with writing styles, where I could get to know characters who an editor in New York or Washington might not be interested in. And that was my goal, to get beyond the headlines and to tell stories from cartoonist offices. And as Dirk so really kindly said, to then migrate from there to artist studios, literary salons, editorial meetings, museums, libraries, lecture halls, Comic-Cons, and openings, and we'll get to this later, closings. Not usually the type of closings we think about here in the West or in the US. I started by buying every newspaper every day and clipping the comics, getting to know each comic artist, interviewing them. That was one insight, but I realized I couldn't really understand what was happening unless I was also reading novels and watching films and sort of immersing myself in this much wider community of art production. And I think that's what if I could say what I've accomplished in these 2 years was I've been able to expand my purview into all these new fields of study. I wrote in my first newsletter, this was in May 2015, and you don't have to sing along, but I don't mind. They paved Tahrir and put up a parking garage. And that's what happened. We were so euphoric about this 2011 uprising. which was smattered to pieces in 2013. And we can talk about the complex nuances and different narratives, but at the end of the day, the hopes of young people in 2011 have largely been dissipated. The resurgence of autocracy and repression means that art and culture have become one of the few spaces where dissidents can even gather and hang out. I'll talk to you a little later about how the media fits into all of this, but one of my guiding questions, and something I've asked artists and creative people across the region is, what is the role of the artist or the intellectual today? And I'm not going to give you one answer, but I will tell you one takeaway I've had from all of these discussions, is that art is not a soft topic. It's not an easy topic. It's not something to be filed away or to be considered light. I think it gets to the heart of what it means to be, okay, we could say a human, but what it means to be an Egyptian today, what it means to be American today. And though it might be easier to get an audience with the Minister of Culture than the Minister of Defense, in a country like Egypt where there's a Soviet-like structure of government, even the intellectual class has been mobilized in the service of the state. When President Sisi, now president, when he was a general running for office in the spring of 2014, he would meet with intellectuals. That was an important backbone to his efforts to galvanize the country. And in fact, he tweeted, this is one of my archived tweets, artists are the heart and soul of the nation. This is General Sisi running for office. Now, what I've maintained over these several years researching is that a country of 92 million people like Egypt has many hearts and souls, has many consciences, and these are the voices I've sought to amplify and the voices I've sought to share. On newsletters, I wrote monthly dispatches from Algiers, Beirut, Cairo, and Istanbul, writing at first about comic artists and then about a whole variety of fields. One persistent theme was the crackdown on arts practice in all these spaces and what role artists can play when a state is stifling them. There's ones I wish I would have written, but there just wasn't enough time. I danced tango in Cairo. Perhaps that's an article you'll see down the line. That would have been the most fun. I started researching what happened to the graffiti artists who were so prominent in 2011, but have since been forced to go underground and be anonymous. Again, that was what was so incredible about this fellowship, was to find a topic, to spend a month gnawing on it and thinking about it, and meeting everyone you could possibly discuss about this topic, and then saying, oh, that's not going to work. But obviously it continued to inform my growth and my own writing. What did I learn? And this might be useful for our incoming fellows who are timidly sitting as I was 2.5 years ago in the back. Language goes a long way. Just having put in the hours and reading Arabic, I could speak with whomever I wanted. I could meet with the former minister. I could meet with Adonis, the poet, and speak with him in informal Arabic, just because I put in the hours. And I think that was a major dynamic and a piece of advice I offer to the incoming class. Persistence. I always think being a journalist is a lot like being a detective and tracking leads and tracking all sorts of surprising twists and turns. And there's some writers I've been trying to meet with for 2 years, and they finally answered their phone a month ago. So that's what it takes if you want to really tell stories. And if there's one thing I could discover, and it's not just about Cairo, it's about these magnificent cities across the region, Alexandria, Algiers, Beirut, and getting to know them and the connections and the deep history. And for me, the early 20th century and mid-20th century, perhaps really untouched histories that really demand our stories. I could paint for you a map of downtown Cairo, every alley, every shopkeeper. I could take you through, and as I did in one newsletter, the very popular market of Ataba that continues on for 3 miles in each direction, and you can find just about anything, but I spend most of my time in the book market there. And it was the literal exploration of turning corners and getting lost and having that extra coffee till the sun went down. that really was a definitive aspect of my fellowship. What about the newsletters that didn't work? I want to just tell you one quick story. I was in Istanbul on the cusp of last summer's failed coup. I spent June and some of July in Istanbul. And there was this indie record shop, a little one-room record shop called the Velvet Indie Ground. They were having a Radiohead listening party. A lot of kids hanging out, drinking beer, listening to music outside on the street in a gentrifying neighborhood. And it was Ramadan, and a group of thugs came and beat up several of these, mind you, not protesters, several of these guys listening to Radiohead and gals and people hanging out. So I went shop to shop on that street and tried to interview every single person who had witnessed it. I talked to the record owner only after we connected over the album he was playing. He was really reluctant to speak. I put a lot of work into thinking about why other art galleries in this gentrifying neighborhood in Istanbul were being attacked. It's been a trend over several years, whether the police turned a blind eye, what people in the neighborhood saw, what the British guy 5 floors up had witnessed. And I couldn't really get to the bottom of it, and by the time I had, this failed coup totally changed the fabric of Istanbul. So stay tuned for that story. But again, this is what the fellowship was about. And that's why it was meaningful for me, was to get out of my comfort zone and to have an ongoing conversation about the complexity of contemporary Egypt and the wider region. And I really couldn't have done this without a strong network of friends and the support of my girlfriend, Surti, who I'll talk about a bit later. And I'm really proud to have spent these 2 years tracking down these stories. Oh, this was a treat for you, Mickey Mouse smoking hookah from the 60s, a non sequitur in case I needed a laugh. I want to give you 3 examples of what the fellowship allowed me to do, and I'm going to frame it as follows. I want to tell you that ICWA has allowed me to research the present, the past, and the future of Egypt and the wider Middle East. First, let me tell you the story about the present, and Edward gave us a teaser about this, but I'll give you the more play-by-play of how this article in Rolling Stone came about. Young novelist Ahmed Nagy, we were actually on a panel together speaking about the history of Arab comics, and a court case was against him for obscenity, for disturbing the public decency, one of these really vague catch-all terms that's rarely used, but of course used as a politically inflected charge against agitators. Now, Ahmed's story was well covered in the press. He was a journalist himself and a novelist, and no one thought he would be put in jail. In fact, he was found innocent in January 2016. When the appeal came down in February 2016, he was found guilty and was in Tora prison, known as Scorpion Prison, the most notorious and really dehumanizing space for someone to be in Cairo. And of course, we're all busy people, and it's hard to keep track of a long-term story like this, especially when you have raging conflicts across Egypt and the Sinai and the Libyan border in the south, and also conflicts across the region. So all of my reporter friends are really overworked and don't have time to dive deeply. But I kept following Ahmed's story because this is what the fellowship allowed me to do, to stay really committed to one story over 18 months. In July of 2016, he had already been in prison for 6 months. I went to the appeal hearing. This appeal ended up failing. Ahmed, who you see here, was in a cage. He was in a cage in a courtroom. It was 100 degrees if we were lucky, and it was only 10 a.m. on this July morning. It was packed with cigarette smoke. The fans weren't working. There were about a dozen convicted felons in the cage with him. And of course, as I said, I'd been following the story, but it hit me that everyone needs to hear Ahmed's story. This is a writer, this is a novelist in the year 2016 that is serving time for fiction. Perhaps the first time in Egyptian history, at least since the 50s or 60s, that someone's been charged for fiction. So I met with his fiancée, I met with his brother, I met with everyone connected with him, editors, friends, writers, went to another hearing, And as Edward alluded to, I ultimately tracked down the kind of disgruntled 60-something-year-old attorney who brought this quite absurd court case against him for disturbing the public decency, for an excerpt of his novel that had some really sexually explicit language, but really nothing new for what's being published in the literary culture of Egypt. Now, again, it's one of those stories where even though it's published in Rolling Stone, and I feel like I've gotten to the bottom of it, there's still that dynamic of you never know. I can't figure out how was the state really involved. I can't figure out to what extent the inertia or the bureaucracy or the moral policing of prosecutors are the cause of this. But I'm really proud to have shared with a really wide audience, not a Middle East specialist audience, but an audience that's interested in sex, drugs, and rock and roll, as it were, for Rolling Stone, of a story that has a real human component that I think was an honor to pursue. This is his collection of short stories that he's just put out since he's been in prison. And look, the story still continues, and this is why it's the strange saga, right? His ruling was overturned 2 or 3 weeks ago, but there's going to be a retrial. So who knows what that means? And he can't travel abroad, even though his wife has a appointment at a university in the States. And he's sort of trapped in limbo, as it were. And I don't want to, as I sort of said this morning for those who are here, I don't like to extract some kind of bigger meaning about this because it's really one man's story. But as I learn more about Ahmed and the reasons why he was in prison, which were seemingly arbitrary, and the processes that he's still going through, in a way it is a universal story about what it is to struggle in this archaic Soviet-like bureaucracy that engulfs much of Egypt. Now, to the past. This is Sonallah Ibrahim, one of the great novelists of modern Egypt, writing since late 50s, early 60s. When I say ICWA's helped me think about the past in modern Egypt, I'm not just interested in the revolutionaries of 2011. I wanted to get to the bottom of the revolutionaries of 1952, 1956. I wanted to get to the bottom of what happened in 67. And I recently had the occasion to sit with Sonallah several times. He's, done to the Arabic language what some have compared to Hemingway in terms of chiseling down what's quite ornate prose into a much condensed, concise, and punchy manner. And he's like, not the easiest guy to hang out with, but thanks to advice from Elliot Kola, who I want to acknowledge, who's a dear friend and a professor who I study with at Brown University, I had the advice to bring a couple beers when you go sit with Sonallah, and we sat for hours, and I met his wife, and he told me that ancient Egyptians, they were the first people to strike, to hold labor strikes because they weren't getting their beer rations. So, but more to the point, I've been really fascinated in sort of the old school intellectuals, the older guard. And part of that researching history, these are some books I came across in the Cairo book market. One of my pet projects is crime fiction and detective fiction. And I brought these to Sonallah 2 weeks ago because I was doing one last research project about crime novels. These are from the 20s and 30s. And he said, "Can I keep those?" So I let him have one. But the fact of the matter is, it's allowed me to get so deep into the cultural fabric of the country that I'm really grateful for this opportunity. These are the kind of places where I spend a lot of my time. This is an archivist. Archivist is a generous word for it. It's more like a junk collector I know who has basically every book in every newspaper and dozens of rooms like this where I'd spend hours finding newspapers and comics that help tell a story that I don't think has really been told, at least in English and at least in the recent period. These are the kind of things I find, comics and cultural magazines from the 20s and 30s, and this is what I'll be working on in the coming period, is writing a book about this basically unknown history of the emergence of Arab comic art and popular periodicals. I stumbled across amazing things. This is in an antique shop in downtown Cairo. It's a caricature of Josephine Baker. And I didn't believe it when the antique seller told me about it. It's by a very famous Egyptian French painter, Georges Sabar, one of the early modernists working in the teens, 20s, and 30s. So I went home and I looked it up. It turns out Josephine Baker had been entertaining the Allied troops at the Shepherd Hotel. I think she was there in 43 or 44. Now, if only ICWA had given me 5,000 euro to buy this, but I didn't get that chance. But incredible to do this kind of urban archaeology, which is when you spend enough time somewhere, it seems like cartoons and comics just follow me around wherever I go. This is Adonis, who we had mentioned. I interviewed in Paris, and again, it seems like I like to pick the toughest people to interview, but a controversial figure for his support of the Assad regime or tacit support of the Assad regime, but a seminal figure in Arabic poetry. I'm really excited that I was able to speak to him in Arabic. For me, that was what made these conversations with Sonala and others that I really am honored to have played that role. Now, one other person I wanted to mention, who was one of the first ICWA fellows in the Middle East, George Antonius. Now, this is a guy who seems to follow me around wherever I go, this kind of echo of ICWA past. He's written the formative book on Arab nationalisms in the Mandate Palestine period and traveling throughout the Middle East, studying Arab nationalist movements. And it's really the source text for anyone who's studied Middle East studies. And his telegrams, he filed his newsletters as telegrams, are all available in the ICWA office, and every time I go, I peel through them, and it's totally fascinating to see him taking a train to Sudan. Why do I bring him up? Sunallah Ibrahim, the novelist, he gave the George Antonius lecture at Oxford University in the mid-2000s. I was researching a little-known surrealist movement in Cairo in the 30s and 40s. This was actually George's in-laws were actively involved in this movement. And there was something quite meaningful about being a part of this ICWA lineage. And maybe it's a little biblical, but to trace myself back to one of these great writers and correspondents really made it an inspiration. It wasn't just doing this for myself. It was being part of a bigger story of trying to inform a wider public about current world affairs, as it were. And even when I went to Alexandria and I had E.M. Forrester's, it's an absolute classic, guide to Alexandria, the acknowledgement there was for George Antonius. So I think it's really incredible to be part of this much longer and deeper history. The last piece I want to tell you about is the present and the future. Actually, the future, sorry. This is the story that's still happening. There's no resolution of an independent news outlet in Egypt known as Mada Masr. It's one of the few watchdog publications. They publish in Arabic and English. They publish investigative reporting, commentary, cultural roundups that are really useful if you want to know what films to see. Also, economic reporting that's often absent. And I'm really pleased to say I've written a couple articles for them. I've been quoted in articles for them. It's an everyday read. It's something when you wake up in the morning, you check. Just about 2 weeks ago, not even, 10 days ago, the Egyptian government blocked access to Mada Masr. And along with 20 other websites for various reasons. And there's speculation, of course, that President Trump and President Sisi and other Middle East leaders met for this countering terror summit last week in Saudi Arabia. There was question of whether the Egyptian government has been galvanized by this unmitigated support from Washington. There's a question of, the way I've come to know Egypt, that it could be a fluke. They could have been added to the list by accident. It could be, one single article they published last week or 2 weeks ago, right before the blockage, about the diplomatic corps in Egypt being co-opted by the secret services. Quite a poignant article. So I think it's been blocked and unblocked, and certain servers are now having it blocked in Egypt. So now, I mean, they're quite resilient. They're posting their full articles on Facebook, and it's a kind of whack-a-mole solution for now until, the intense internet surveillance has a cost for them in terms of social media. But I want to introduce you to Mada Masr, which it translates into English roughly as Egypt's scope, kind of offering the full scope of this country, because I think they really embody some of the core tenets of journalism, and it's absolutely worrisome that they aren't able to publish freely, at least for now. One of the people, many friends and colleagues have written or worked for them. One of the people I want to, and this is how their webpage looks for us here in Washington. We can look at it quite freely, but as I say, currently being blocked in Egypt. I want to recognize the cartoonist Andil, who I've come to know really well. He's about my age. He's become a really dear friend. I had the chance to profile him in Harper's last year. This guy is the first cartoonist to draw a caricature of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Now, in Egypt, there's a regulation that says insults to the president are forbidden. It's been haphazardly enforced since the Mubarak years, and as I've written about, cartoonists are pros when it comes to breaking or bending the rules. But I would not go as far to say that Andil's cartoons are the reason why this website is blocked. But I would say that it's one of the reasons why this website is so courageous, that they're willing to publish a cartoon. Here's a military officer and a Muslim Brotherhood guy. They both have weapons pointed at one each other. The military guy's saying, "I'm killing him because he's a terrorist." The Brotherhood gentleman says, "I'm a terrorist because he's killing me." And it's that singular power of cartoons to convey an uncomfortable narrative and to raise a discomfort in the viewer. One of the great things about Mada Masr publishing in English and Arabic is they translate his cartoons, so all of you can access them as well. So why was Mada Masr blocked or censored at this moment? According to a security source, which was quoted in many Egyptian news services, they were blocked inside Egypt for having content that supports terrorism and extremism, as well as publishing lies. Publishing lies, spreading falsehoods. This is a charge I think we've all come to know recently as fake news. In Egypt, fake news is illegal. There's over 70 regulations that limit speech that are particularly prevalent for journalists, and among them is publishing falsehoods. So for us, it may be a tiresome buzzword, but unfortunately, this catch-all phrase is why 3 Al Jazeera journalists were imprisoned for about a year and a half in the aftermath of Morsi's overthrow. That's the reason why a gentleman called Hisham Ganina, who is the country's top corruption watchdog, yes, the top corruption watchdog, was indicted for sharing fake information. It's a serious charge. It can ruin lives, it can ruin careers. But one of the things, I think since the past few days, there was a story in the Times about Mada Masr being blocked, but the threshold for news is so high when it comes out of Egypt. I haven't even gotten to this, I don't think I'll have time tonight, these really tragic attacks on Christian communities, cathedrals, and churches. Of course, these are headline breaking news that demand attention, but when there's this much tragedy, equally important stories don't make it into the Washington Post or the New York Times, or they do whenever there's space. So again, I think that's a testament to what this fellowship's allowed me to do. I wanted to end my remarks tonight about Mada Masr because they are doing original reporting in Egypt, and I think it behooves us to be reading and supporting independent journalists wherever they're working, and to be concerned, not to point the finger at any particular government or office, but if human rights and free speech and these concerns become less of a priority to Washington and the State Department, then I greatly fear that there'll be more of this tacit approval of this kind of censorship. And yet, dissent endures. The gentleman who made this Facebook meme, this Facebook image of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and Mickey Mouse ears, he's also in prison. Amr Nohan, he was a military conscript. And actually, he didn't make this. He just shared it on Facebook. I wanted to contrast that with this image of President Sisi steering the ship of state on the new Suez Canal. That's how the state newspapers depict the current president of Egypt. So it goes to show you just how rabble-rousing the cartoonists who I've gotten to know truly are. And I thought this cartoon was a lovely takeaway, too, of a kind of the image of the terrorist hanging out and smoking a hookah while a young revolutionary was being carted away as being, the villain or the criminal. And similarly, the red lines are such a huge concern and a huge question, and this by the cartoonist Anwar just shows, some unnamed official drawing a red line over everybody's mouths. So I just want to offer a few special thanks and acknowledge a few people before we open the floor to questions. It's hard to be your man in Cairo, and I really couldn't have done it without so much support of friends and family. I want to first acknowledge my partner Surti Singh, who can't be here tonight. She is giving a talk at the Frankfurt School, or the Goethe University's philosophy department. So she's busy prepping for that. But really, she's been a source of collaboration and conversation. We recently wrote an article together about Egyptian modern art, but so many of my newsletters, my articles, and just the way I consider a lot of these questions came out of our conversations. And I really wish you all would have had a chance to meet her tonight. I also want to recognize someone named Scott Mcleod, who is my longtime boss with the Cairo Review. He's a veteran journalist for Time magazine. Actually, the first journalist to interview Osama bin Laden in Sudan in '96. And he's been a mentor for me during what are very difficult times to be a journalist in Cairo, when an Italian graduate student, Giulio Regeni, was killed last winter in quite shady circumstances, presumably by authorities. I had people like Scott Mcleod and there as a mentor and as a friend, so I'm really grateful. Next is Elliot Kola, who's a professor at Georgetown, but I know him first as my professor at Brown, who opened my mind to Arabic literature, and now really as a friend and someone I can run ideas by. And I'm really, I first read Naguib Mahfouz, the great Egyptian Nobel Prize-winning novelist, in Eliot's class. I first heard of all of these names like Mahmoud Darwish and Adonis, so I'm really grateful to have taken it forward. Thank you. I want to recognize our panelists and presenters this morning. Rosina Ali of Cairo Review and The New Yorker, Ali Abdel Mohsen, who's a painter whose work I urge you to check out, Ganzir, who designed our outstanding poster and who has been erroneously maybe called the Banksy of Egypt, but check out his work if you haven't seen it. Yasmin El-Rashidi, a novelist and writer, and Maimuna Farhat. But really, it was difficult to be abroad for this time, and I'm really grateful for my family. My sister, Sarah Geyer, who's a professor at Madison, Wisconsin, who, as a comparative literature scholar, has really opened my mind up to a lot of questions. And her husband, Scott Strauss, who was a journalist in Rwanda during the genocide, and probably wouldn't be here today if I wasn't regaled by his stories as a younger gentleman. I also want to acknowledge my sister, Erica Geyer, and her husband, Danny Franklin, who have been a huge wealth of love and support. And my sister, Erica, who we traveled through Southeast Asia and Egypt and Turkey together many years ago. And of course, my parents, Cheryl and Dan, who went 18 months without seeing me, who I think were shocked when I sat them down already 6 years ago at a restaurant in Washington saying, I'm going to write about Arab comics. I'm going to get a Fulbright. I'm going to go to Cairo. I'm going to figure out what's happening with cartoons. And I think they just laughed at me and said, that is not a job. And I think it was good because it's pushed me to work harder and to find new stories and to traverse the region and come back and share with you my stories. But most of all, the people that this talk is about and the people I really want to thank are, I don't like this word subjects, but at the end of the day, the subjects of my writing, the people who I had the honor to sit with. Because look, I can leave Egypt. I have this great American passport, and here I am. But my friend Ahmed Nagy, the novelist, is in Cairo and can't leave. And I admire and commend their bravery in the face of autocracy, their ingenuity. And here I'm speaking of many cartoonists, writers, filmmakers, journalists who I've had the real honor to have met. I admire their passion, and most of all, I admire their sense of humor. The fact that to many of us in this room, we might look at these risks and shiver, and they scoff at them and keep working. So if there's anyone I would ask for a round of applause, it's for the people I've had the honor to chronicle over the past 2 years.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for some questions.
Can I come down?
Thanks very much, Jonathan, for a terrific talk. Can you say how last year's presidential election in the U.S. was depicted, if at all, and what the people whom you talked to and interviewed feel
Sure,
about,
and sorry I've been up at this podium. I had my little notes, but now I can be more casual. One of the most peculiar things I would imagine to people in this room who I know you're all very well informed but don't know the nuances of Egypt is that President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton are just the devil in Cairo. And there's this huge misconception, rightly or not, that they are Muslim Brotherhood members or that President Obama created ISIS. And there's this incredible yellow press in Cairo that reinforces this, as I say, to us, false narrative, but perception is reality. So while we all know President Trump has made his Muslim ban a signature act of policy, many Egyptians who I've encountered, and not the Tom Friedman taxi drivers, but prominent artists and writers, were quite supported or at least interested in Trump. And we're really grateful for a change and see Hillary Clinton is incredibly in bed with Qatar and Israel and all these unsavory characters who are caricatured in the worst light. So it's been a fascinating time. I wrote a newsletter about this, about being at the election watching party at the Nile Ritz-Carlton with all of the American diplomats in November. And of course, not just American diplomats, there are 500 people there from across various spectrum of Egyptian society. And I think we all woke up that morning and didn't know exactly what to make of it because we were 6-7 hours ahead. So we found out the election when we woke up. And I think the government in Cairo is still working it out. I think it's a big open question. Any questions?
I'm curious, you obviously interviewed an array of artists, cartoonists, novelists, and in Egypt, obviously, the question of gender is important. Sexual harassment and abuse is a huge issue, and I wonder if you had the opportunity to interview or speak with any female artists and see the role of gender and sexual relations in the way that art informs politics in Egypt.
It's a terrific question. I mean, Egypt, not unlike other societies we're familiar with, is highly patriarchal. And the field of cartooning is already, especially in the US and the UK, a highly male-dominated field. So there's very few female cartoonists, but the ones that there are working are terrifically talented, and I've had the chance to interview some of them. One cartoonist in particular, Doa El Adel, who draws for one of the biggest daily newspapers, she's drawn a huge amount of cartoons about female genital mutilation, really a hot button issue that very few people in Egypt would be willing to talk about. She's publishing cartoons about the suppression of women's rights in one of the most widely circulated broadsheets. But, it's something that, one strives for a gender balance and to not have, like my talk, unfortunately, dominated by male voices. But actually, it's a chance to think about, why are there so many men who come to prominence in Egyptian arts and letters? Where are the women? I was just working on a BBC documentary about crime novels, and at a certain point, when there aren't very many women crime novelists, instead of just trying to pick any woman who writes a novel, you want to ask, well, why aren't there? And are women being excluded? And I don't have great answers to all these questions, but I think they're the right questions to ask.
How much traction do any of these cartoons have outside the urban areas to the more conservative rural?
That's a terrific question. Most of the newspapers in Egypt are published in Cairo. Even Alexandria, the second largest city, doesn't really have any newspapers, or has one or two, but they're not serious, wide circulation dailies. So it's this strange thing where, can you imagine if every newspaper in America was coming from New York and there wasn't an Omaha daily and a Philadelphia daily? I think that's changing a lot with the net. And you look at certain cartoons, I don't know the exact numbers, but mobile phone penetration is huge. Most people are getting social media access through their phones. Everyone's sharing videos and viral clips. So actually, sometimes you see a cartoon and it has tens of thousands of likes, or you see a satirical video and it has 3 million watches. So obviously Cairo has 23 million people. I don't know exactly how far it's reaching, and I think that's something I wish I would have addressed. If I have one regret from the fellowship, it's not spending enough time in the kind of Netherlands of Egypt. I've had a chance to spend a lot of time in Alexandria, but not quite a lot of time in the rural areas, and part of that is a function of what it is to be a journalist or a writer in Egypt in this period, where it's much more difficult to work and do interviews and to parachute in to areas you're not familiar with. So I really kind of doubled down and got to know every neighborhood of Cairo and everyone I could find there. Oh, Lena? Is this our last question? Okay. Please.
Oh, thank you. I was wondering if you could talk about the reaction to the Charlie Hebdo while you were in Egypt, and was there anything about that incident that surprised you?
Absolutely. And this is something, I think I was really honored to write widely about, because I think there's a monolithic perception of the Muslim world as kind of seeing everything as violent as those attackers of Charlie Hebdo in Paris, when in fact, almost every cartoonist, I could say that without doubt, every cartoonist I interviewed in Egypt, as well as Algiers, Beirut, across the region, said this was a heinous crime. And even there are cartoonists who say this was disrespectful, this was an abomination, this shouldn't be published, but they will defend their right to draw whatever their French colleagues want. And I think this narrative was missing in the kind of black and white stories that came out of that attack, because it's obviously a lot easier to have a good and evil kind of scenario. And this isn't to say I agree with Charlie Hebdo. I think some of the stuff they do is quite disgusting and unseemly, but of course I think they have the right to do it. And many cartoonists in Egypt were, I actually don't want to make any generalizations. Some were highly critical of them and think they were just seeking attention. Others would say, I am a Muslim and I support Charlie Hebdo on Facebook. So it was a really fascinating topic, and we can continue to talk after.